You're listening to the Flight and History Experience. This is episode 2536. Today we're talking about standardization and diversification within flight, from all the way from airports to the experience of passengers to the airlines themselves.
Our sponsors today are HelloFresh and
MeUndies.
We will have a brief intermission for those later in the episode. All right, I'm going to start here. So we started with the standardization of airports, specifically the architecture. I did a bunch of interesting research talking about different emergency services. One of the really interesting ones that I saw was airport emergency services. There's a lot more than you think there would be. There's structural teams. So there's one of them is for if the building, planes, or any of the parts of the the actual facilities start to fail. There's an entire team dedicated to removal of those structures, to dealing with fires, jet fuel fires. There's also not just jet fuel. There's other combustible fuels, oils, cleaners, tons of also all the different equipment also needs fuels as well. So there's a lot of very dangerous chemicals that all have safety procedures within them. And there's also a whole team dedicated to just that. There's teams dedicated to fires, teams dedicated to natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, rain, volcanoes, floods. Volcanoes is an interesting one. I never would have thought about that. There's also hazardous goods. I know specifically if they find some types of bomb squads, obviously, but there's also other ones where food contamination, bugs, pests, all that kind of stuff is interesting. They try to make sure that they don't spread diseases among a lot of different things. There's a hijacking team, terrorism team, obviously. That's probably one you can tell from a mile away. There's power. That's an interesting one as well. There's there's a whole systems team dedicated to running the electricity, running the generators, backup systems, because especially if there are planes in the air and power goes out on the floor, that's not a good combo, right?
Not at all.
There's also a hacking team. I never would have thought about that. If hacking goes down, they actually have a full system dedicated to paper. They pull papers and pens out, and they pull the ham radios out, and they run that because it's better than nothing, right? That's also what they did back in the day. I imagine that scenario is pretty rare, but if it happens, that would be a pretty interesting dynamic between the flight crews trying to go back to pencil and paper.
So interestingly that you bring that up, I think it was just a couple years ago, there was a big issue with Southwest there's a big snowstorm where everything got canceled and the system got so overwhelmed that they actually went back to pencil and paper to do startup safety procedures. And I mean, that system is still in place, but it also shows how the system that we've lived with for the past 30, 40, 50 years, it hasn't really changed much. So as soon as there's one issue with it, everything goes down, and you can always go back and rely on that pencil and paper.
Yeah, and it's pretty fragile too. One thing, the whole thing goes down.
A lot of interconnected bits is what I'm seeing here, because they have all these teams because every single part of the structure matters. There was also water rescue. I saw because of when I think it was Sully, right? That movie. A water rescue team I never would have imagined is stationed at an airport. Same thing with obviously EMS services are there. Waste removal. I never would have thought about, if a plane crashes on the runway or something fails, they got to get rid of it because they got to keep running planes, right? So there's also crowd control and police and law enforcement obviously stationed there as well. You see those at the TSA.
So they have all these guys stationed at all the airports?
Yeah, they're on staff. That's nuts to me. That's the reason why a lot of these airports have such high operating costs, is because they have so many people there because safety, because that's why also airports are the safest form of transport. So it was a interesting dive into seeing all those. Construction was another one where they talked about the number of the ways that they construct, they even plan. They have to have big areas that they build the airports. They have to have places where they can. So slowly they'll expandability areas. They had how you place the runways, because headwinds are a big thing. If they build runways, there's 5 or 6 different types of runway layouts. There's a V, parallel, X, cross. There was quite a few of them, and they all were for different weather patterns. I never would have thought that they would be based on weather patterns, and especially if there's mountains nearby, that causes a different type of weather pattern. And geography was a huge thing.
Yeah, I could go into back with airports. Specific airlines will completely standardize what planes they use.
Yeah.
So that way, they only have to train their pilots on one model of airline. Pilots can shift around to where they're needed. And a lot of airports, again, specifically for like American Airlines, they have a hub airport in New York where they'll have a bunch of planes sitting around and they'll send them all off at the same time and have planes come in at the same time, specifically to work with connecting flights. So when they have planes that, coming from the west into New York and they need those flights to connect out to, say, they're going over to Europe, they want those planes to fly at those same times so that way they can standardize it. Speaking of different countries, all over the world, since the 1944 Chicago Invention, which started it's not the five functions of the five freedoms of flight.
Oh.
Specifically, the fourth and fifth freedom were used by the U.S. and the U.K. Initially to help transport between the U.S. and the U.K. for passengers and cargo, and it allowed U.S. companies to fly over to the U.K., land there, pick up passengers and cargo, and either fly back or move on to their next destination. And this helped countries communicate with each other on, breaking down those borders and having them work together rather than always competing for more share in the airline industry. And now today we have the International Air Transport Association, or the IATA, which includes 304 airlines currently from all around the world, from China to Russia to Spain, Turkey, US and Canada, Australia, Brazil, Korea, and a bunch more. And this helps all airlines around the world control both safety regulations, so that way people are as safe as possible in the sky, as well as controlling emissions to help with pollution in the world. Obviously, flying planes is not great for emissions, but it's great to at least control it so you're not destroying the air faster than you need to, I guess. And something this also helps with is code share flights. And code share flights allow airlines to talk to other airlines and have agreements with other airlines, so that way they can buy tickets on each other's airlines to help passengers get to where they're trying to go in the most efficient way possible.
Yeah, I feel like we should touch on that a little bit more, because I've been to the airport a few times, and I think we all know it can be a crazy mess just going in there. Sometimes it's a system that they have, but sometimes when you're new to flying, it can be kind of crazy. But it's kind of cool that some airports are kind of actually incorporating technology into their customers. So I researched a little bit about these things called SSBDs. They're called self-service bag drops. It's basically just a computer that you can go up, type in your information, and then you can print out your boarding pass, your bag tags, and you literally just put it on a scale, tells you how much it is, and then you just put it right on the plane. So they're trying to cut out some of the more middlemen to make it more efficient just in every airport.
Speaking of diversity between airlines, what's the deal with airplane food?
Oh, she had to do it.
I was trying to hold back. Anyway, so the in-flight experience is definitely the most diverse aspect of flying, depending on what airline you're with, what section of the plane you're in, whether you're on a domestic or international flight. Is it a budget airline? Sometimes it's even where you're going to. In the 70s, on Pan Am flights from Alaska to Japan, you'd be served teriyaki and rice. So sometimes it'll be topical like that. And food is sort of how airlines can differentiate themselves, because having in-flight meals is absolutely not necessary on most flights. It's to add to the customer experience and make the airline look better. So Marcus Beiswanger, I wanted to bring him up. He wrote an essay about airplane food and the local and the global aspects of it, which I thought would be pretty relevant to this. And the first example he used was actually on Zeppelins. And he talked about how local restaurants in Germany used to prepare the food before takeoff to be served on board, and they'd serve German foods and wines and sausages and the such. And one of the chefs on the Graf Zeppelin, Otto Menz, was quoted in the New York Times as saying this food was intended to serve as an effective ambassador for German industry and culture, So the meaning behind airline food was understood pretty close to its conception. But this would also have to be balanced out with the fact that they would be catering to passengers from around the world, all with different tastes and cultures and backgrounds, which would be like the global aspect of flight cuisine. Like, how do you make something unique but also palatable to everyone? So the example on Zeppelins was like eggs could be cooked different ways because they used to be served different ways depending on where you're from. And this sort of practice continued into commercial aviation and jet airliners, with each airline company having to decide how they were going to balance like the local and the global. And you could also like describe this as being the balance between standardization and diversification with airplane food.
Oh yeah, I totally see that, especially because like as more and more people are using it, like using airplanes and flying, you lose that sense of like, I guess, yeah, that sense
novelty.
of novelty.
Yeah, and that's actually like why we have the Diet Coke and pretzel thing now, because like the height of in-flight cuisine was during the golden age of aviation in like the 50s and 60s, when flying was basically only possible for the uber wealthy. So that's when you'd have like people being served champagne and lobster and having like ham cut for them right by their seat. And then in the 70s with deregulation, it became a lot cheaper to fly, and so a lot more people were flying, and it was impossible to keep up with all of this like fanfare.
Yeah.
Food acted like an entertainment to people.
It's the whole idea of like at economies at scale lose a sense of heart, I guess, right? Like you lose that sense of like individuality, which is kind of an argument to be made toward standardization. Like, yeah, it increases your the more people's ability to use these things, and it makes everybody have a more shared experience. But at the same time, you kind of lose that aspect of what made the flying and the airlines special in some way.
So a Scandinavian Airlines menu in the 40s, and the first item was a smorgasbord. Like, imagine having one of those on a flight. And there were some airplanes that would like have cured meats for you and stuff. Like, it used to be so fun, but it just got too expensive. So it's become a lot more standardized in that aspect over time. And then the most standardized aspect of the in-flight experience in food would have to be the preparation and safety standards, because you absolutely cannot have like foodborne illness or improper storage, stuff like that, on a commercial flight. That's very dangerous for people. So they have really strict hygiene standards no matter what manufacturer is making the food. I saw an interesting article that said because of income inequality and the rise in income inequality across the world, they think that the in-flight experience is going to become much more showy in the future because it'll be exclusive again.
Oh yeah, especially with like you can talk about the space travel. Wow, right?
Yeah, that's a new thing that's coming around.
Yeah,
but I want to talk quickly about FedEx specifically and how international cargo, because right now on flights you have both. Even on commercial flights, you still have some cargo on board that's not necessarily luggage, but even on those lighter flights, they can transport cargo back and forth. But FedEx specifically is a company that handles, a ton of cargo all around the world. And the way that they handle that is actually just by buying other companies. So then FedEx controls, global transport in the air. And that leads to, a different version of globalization than we've seen before. Because in the past, it was countries trying to connect with countries and trying to break down those borders and work together. But now we're seeing billion-dollar corporations kind of take matters into their own hands and purchase other companies so they can control global transport of cargo, of people, of anything they can.
Yeah, when you control every aspect of the system, it's pretty easy to make it standard, right?
Yeah,
so it makes everything work.
If you make it standard, the whole goal is, standardization leads to efficiency, to try to cut as many costs as possible, trying to cut as many corners as possible without, breaking whatever regulations there are, maybe breaking